Hello and welcome to the Intentional Clinician Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Krauss, licensed professional counselor. Welcoming back to the show for his second appearance is Dr. James Leiter, Ph.D. I had a lot of feedback about his first episode, so he's back again. This time we're going to discuss depth work in ecotherapy and introducing James's own take on ecotherapy called Hilltending. You may have heard the first episode about ecopsychology and ecotherapy, and if you haven't, I recommend you listen to that episode first. However, if you're really into ecotherapy and Jungian concepts, this episode is for you. We will take a deep dive into those concepts. A little bit about Dr. James Leiter. He has a Ph.D. and he has been facilitating nature-based archetypal experiences and integration around the world for many years. He has a Ph.D. in depth psychology under Jungian and archetypal studies, and a certificate in ecopsychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. His doctoral research provides a foundation for an archetypally patterned ecotherapy, promoting a regenerative relationship to the entire Earth community. I think whatever your exposure to things regarding the Earth and nature and climate change, or whatever your opinion on it, I think you will really enjoy the balanced perspective that James brings in this interview. And you will also learn about ways that you might be able to get involved in some of James's workshops, his one-on-one work, or his group experiences. All right, let's get to the interview. And welcoming back to the podcast, Dr. James Leiter, Ph.D. After the first podcast we did on ecotherapy and ecopsychology, I had a tremendous response, and so I have brought you back today to talk about depth work in ecotherapy and introducing Hilltending. Welcome back, James.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. So, last time, for people that don't know much about ecotherapy, they should probably listen to the first podcast we did, which sets it up quite nicely. But for those of you who understand a little bit about ecopsychology and ecotherapy, this is a bit of a deeper dive into the subject material. And so I guess one of the first things is we probably should define what in the world depth work is.
Okay. That's depth. D-E-P-T-H. A lot of times people say death work?
Not death work.
No, it's not death work. It's depth work. Deep. We go deep. And basically what that means is that we work with the unconscious aspects of psyche, things that we either are incapable of knowing, or things that we have repressed, or things that we've experienced that did not have enough intensity for it to really enter into consciousness. And a lot of our relationship to nature, to the earth, is unconscious. And so a lot of the depth work in my approach to ecopsychology and ecotherapy is trying to get at some of that unconscious material so that we are able to come into a greater consciousness of our actual relationship to the earth.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. And I know that in your work, you're calling it Hilltending, but I kind of want to give people a few examples of some depth work that they may have heard of through maybe the Jungian community. And some of the things we had kind of talked about were dream work, alchemical work or alchemical eco-narrative, mindfulness practice or mindful practices, somatic exercises such as even just walking or other things like that, or some people actually have what they call rituals that they do. So can you tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll kind of extend it into ecotherapy?
Okay. I might just kind of do both at the same time.
Oh, sure. Let's go there.
So in Hilltending, and Hilltending is my approach to ecopsychology. That's what I call my approach. And what it is, really, the simplest definition is that it is a nature-based archetypal facilitation. So what that means is that the unconscious, especially the collective unconscious, from a Jungian perspective, is structured in the archetypes. And archetypes are universal structures of something that all humans experience at some point. So a prime example of that is the mother, the archetype of the mother. So everyone experiences the mother. It's a very powerful experience, for better or for worse. in our lives. And so there is an archetype of the mother, and the archetypes all have certain attributes, and they can be creative or destructive. I tend to kind of stay away from the idea of positive or negative. So archetypes have creative energies, they have destructive energies. And that's true with the mother, too. If you think about it, I think I mentioned it last time, that the mother can be nurturing, caring, loving, but she can also be terrible. She can be abandoning, and just, downright mean. And I think everyone has had both kinds of experiences with their mother. And so this is an archetypal experience. Our relationship to the earth is also structured archetypally. Our experiences of nature, of earth, of the other than earth community are structured archetypally. And a lot of it is unconscious. And so in Hilltending, we will approach that aspect of our relationship, or those aspects of our relationship, through different Jungian methods. And the primary among those, as you mentioned, is dream work. That's one of the easiest, if most mysterious ways of kind of getting to unconscious material. So Hilltending is based in a lot of different concepts. It's based in Jungian concepts of psychological development, which is called individuation. It's rooted in the concept that the psyche is real, that the full psyche is real, not just the conscious aspects of psyche, but also the unconscious aspects. So the dream presents us with images. And that does not necessarily need to be visual images. It can be other forms of sensory images, but we experience images in our dreams that can be most easily understood as metaphors for some kind of a psychological process or psychological state. And so working with these dreams becomes a way to enter into a dialogue with the unconscious. And that comes, I think I mentioned last time, also a dream that I had of a buffalo, and how that kind of corresponded and was associated with my relationship to the land in North America. So there's another example. I was working with someone once. It was in a park, and there was like the front end of the park was the public kind of thing where there's picnic tables, and there was a basketball court, I think. And the back end of the park was a more forested area with nature trails. But we were walking around the front end of the park and working on a dream. And in the dream that we were working on, the client reported there was a lot of different spherical objects in the dream, a lot of circles and balls and things like that. And as we were walking, there were a group of people that were playing, I think you call it bocce ball. I know it as boules, because when I lived in France, that's where I learned about boules. So they were throwing these little balls around, trying, and chasing after these balls and moving around and picking them up and throwing them and trying to get them close to the marker. They were working with these spherical objects. And so working with dreams, especially when you're outside, as we discussed in some length last time, the whole world joins in. And so there will be these moments of synchronicity that help to bring clarity to what the dream is saying from an ecopsychological perspective. So what is this dream saying about my relationship to the natural world? Where does it come from? Where does it want to go? And so dream work is one of the primary methods that I use in Hilltending. Another one that you mentioned, was alchemical eco-narrative. And so Jung was so, what's the word I'm looking for? Alchemy was very central to his psychology. He found in alchemy a historical prefiguration, what he called a prefiguration of his psychology. And when you think about it, alchemy wants to take lead and turn it into gold, right? So it takes a raw material and turns it into something finished, something better. It's a very transformative process. So another way to get at the unconscious aspects of our relationship to nature is to begin with the raw material, right? And that is the experiences that we have had in nature. And so I will help people go back and remember experiences that they've had in nature from, over the course of their life. What was the first memory that you have, or significant memory that you have of an experience in nature? What happened? Where were you? Who were you with? Things like that. And to kind of move through a progression through their life and you get a lot of information through this. Howard Kleinbell, who wrote the book Ecotherapy, kind of coined the term ecotherapy, called this the Earth story. So I've taken it and moved it in Hilltending from a diagnostic tool to uncover some kind of traumatic event in the past that's causing issues in the present, to become an alchemical tool, a transformative tool to understand what has happened in the past, but more importantly, to understand what is happening in the present and where might it be leading us. Excuse me. So it's moving towards what the alchemists called the philosopher's stone. If our relationship to the earth becomes the philosopher's stone, the finished, desirable, the healthy relationship to the earth becomes the desirable outcome. So we're transforming all of the raw materials of our relationship to the earth into something new, hopefully something better, because there is so much dysfunction in our relationship to the earth, culturally, and a lot of times individually. Most of the time individually, it's so hard to get away. I have to say that the way our culture is structured, it is really easy to participate in things that are destructive to the earth. And so becoming more aware of our relationship to the earth helps us to not only experience a greater sense of wellness and well-being, it also helps to change the way that we are on the earth and the way we participate or choose not to participate in certain kinds of behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just for people not familiar with alchemy, Jung was inspired by the processes of these alchemists, even though obviously the point wasn't the literal quest of their trying to turn lead into gold, but it was their processes and their journals and their philosophical musings of attempting to turn these things. And for a lot of alchemists, it also became more symbolic and was more of a process of them working out their own psychic material. And I know James Hillman has I think like a 9-part lecture that you can purchase about alchemy in psychology, which I've listened to the whole thing. I found it tremendous because he talked about all the different stages and all the different colors and how that relates to the psyche and our relationship with the self. And of course, you're taking it and turning it even into more of the relationship with the natural world.
Well, and as we talked about last time, the distinction between the self and the natural world, is it really there? I don't believe that it is. I believe that the process of ecological individuation towards the ecological self, and the ecological self is where nature and human nature meet.
Correct. I think perhaps, though, we experience the separation, and thus we have that feeling people get. And I remember when I lived in Chicago, we used to just call it like just the city energy would just make you crazy. And I remember that people would say this every 3 or 4 weeks. I just have to get the hell out of Chicago, and I got to take the train up to Evanston, because Evanston has a lot more trees and forests and parks. It's where Northwestern University is. Or, of course, a lot of people who had more funding and means would buy a house in southern Michigan along the coastline between Saugatuck and Indiana. And they would go to their cabin or their retreat center in Michigan just for the weekend, just to get away from that city energy, because you could just feel it pulsing and get into that healing natural world. And so I remember that. But then I even more so, I lived, and I still sometimes, for part of the year, I'm in Phoenix for months at a time due to some work. And I notice in Phoenix, it is a very sprawling and unforgiving landscape. Of course, my friend has called it a testament to man's arrogance to build one of the largest cities in the U.S. in the middle of a place that doesn't have much natural water occurring. But in Phoenix, there's almost an obsession with being in the natural world, and it's almost a pastime there that you see just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people every weekend and every morning, really, getting onto hiking trails or biking trails or mountain biking trails and just getting out of that urban habitat, which sprawls for miles and has more than 6 million people in that small area. So it's that sort of, there's this longing. And so you're right, we aren't separate, but I think we can feel the separateness due to the structures we've built and the microclimates we've built, especially in Phoenix during the summer. If you're out in the desert, it doesn't get as hot, and at night it cools off. But in the urban areas, the concrete and the asphalt and the cars and the constant people running their air conditioning, which produces heat, keep the ambient temperatures over 100 degrees all day and all night, and that can be very oppressive to people. So I agree with you, but I do think we've done some things to feel separate from nature. And
Yes.
I think our ego and the fact that we think we can continually strip the earth of its resources without any sort of consequences have separated us from the natural world and made us seem more like a virus or a parasite.
That's what Paul Shepard called ecological madness. And that was one of the one of the earliest framing questions of the modern discipline of ecopsychology is, why do humans persist in destroying the planet that gives them life? Right? And you mentioned a lot of different landscapes there, which is another important aspect of hilltending that I'd like to mention. That and different people respond differently to different kinds of landscapes, right? So I love being in the mountains. I love being in the forests. Some people love being in the desert. Some people hate being in the desert. I've lived in Europe. I lived in Europe for most of my adult life. I've only been back in my home, the U.S., for 10 years. And so I experienced a lot of different landscapes over there, right? In the rolling hills in Germany, or the semi-arid climate of south of France. And there's a lot of, even going out of the city into the natural world, there's a different energy in different kinds of landscapes. And so hilltending tries to be aware of the client's natural tendency to respond more to a certain kind of landscape or the other, and work with that. Because at the end of the day, that is another image of that person's relationship to the earth, right? What does it say about me that I like mountains better? I grew up in Nebraska, right? There's no, you might get some sand hills way out west, but where I grew up, there's no mountains. So why do I feel most comfortable in mountains? What is that telling me? I mean, that's a question that I've worked with a lot in my own relationship to the earth. And so hilltending takes these things into account. So there's another one of the practices that you listed them off earlier, the somatic aspects of hilltending. Even if it's just walking through the forest, one form of ecotherapy is about regaining a muscle memory that might be lost from sitting too much, being in a cubicle too much, watching too much TV, or anything like that. Just getting out and moving is already a form of ecotherapy. But there are also ecotherapeutic practitioners that practice yoga or tai chi or other somatic exercises outside. I've danced on a beach in Southern California. I'm not a big dancer, but having that experience as a part of a group was pretty remarkable. Rediscovering ranges of movement. And so ecotherapy can also be useful for people who have physical limitations or are recovering from an injury. So there's a lot of, we talked about it quite a bit last time, so I won't go too much into it. There's a lot of different forms of ecotherapy. And so hilltending tries to account for that as well.
And so, and hilltending is your basically approach to ecotherapy that you do primarily in Michigan, but also over the internet with one-on-ones. And also you do one-on-one outside. You've done some inside just when you're first meeting people. And of course, you do the groups that are forthcoming, that are coming up soon. But can you tell me a little bit about we touched on the words last time, but the terracentric and the geocosmological approaches in our relationship to our habitat, the earth, and how that maybe gets into the discussion of holding the opposites.
Okay. Absolutely. So simply put, the terracentric is filled with grief. eco-grief, what I call eco-grief. And that includes a range of emotions about our relationship to the earth. It can be grief, it can be anger, shame, guilt, fear. And the other side of that is the geocosmological, that is filled with awe and celebration at being part of the unfolding cosmos. So the geocosmological does not stop at the earth, but considers the fact that the cosmos, the universe, is the habitat of the earth. And so it takes that into consideration as well. And it's hard to look up into the night sky and look out at the galaxy and the universe and not be filled with awe. And so the geocosmological, if you've ever read Brian Swim or Thomas Berry, that's really a very, very strong, probably the original expression in written form, at least, of the geocosmological in our modern era. So there's a sense of opposites between those. So how can I feel grief on one side and awe and astonishment and celebration on the other side? Right. So a lot of times what people will do is tend to fully inhabit one or the other. And that brings a lot of issues, because what I'm doing when I'm fully overwhelmed by the one or the other, I have completely lost sight of the other. Right? And so that's an imbalance. And our relationship to the earth, generally speaking, is in a state of imbalance. And we tend to go to the one or the other. And so in my doctoral research, what I did was analyze hundreds of written accounts of people's relationship to nature. And these two approaches are what came through. And so through the depth work, through the archetypal facilitation, we are allowed to become more consciously aware of the other side. Right? And to integrate them into something new, where I can go and say, you know what? Yeah, I feel really bad about climate change. I feel really bad about the pollution and the destruction of the earth. But I also am just astonished at this story that is unfolding. Right? And I become able to be filled with both. And it's my belief, and my research supported this, is that the terracentric, that grief and that fear and shame and anger, is only possible because of the geocosmological. If we weren't capable of feeling that awe, we would not feel the grief at losing it. And the problem is we don't want to feel that grief. Humans tend to want to feel good all the time, right? We don't ever want to be sick. We don't want to feel at dis-ease. We want to feel good. And so the geocosmological is kind of easy to move into, but it's not easy, because then we hear the news or we see something that makes us sad, because we love the earth. We are in love with the earth. We are in love with nature. E.O. Wilson called it biophilia, that we are enchanted by life and lifelike processes. And Lovelock talked about the lifelike processes of the earth in the Gaia theory, right? And so when we're filled with that love, we're in love with the earth and with nature and with the other than earth community. And then we see something or hear something that lets us know that is threatened, that is at risk, and we're filled with this incredible grief. And so the part of the Hilltending approach is to become aware of both aspects of how I'm experiencing both aspects of my relationship to the earth, and to bring them together and reintegrate them, because I do feel both, whether I want to or not. Jung said, feeling, a lot of times we don't have feelings have us. And it's true, we can be overwhelmed by these feelings. And so running from them, repressing them, avoiding them, distracting ourselves, works for a while. But eventually, at some point, that complex, that unconscious complex, will rise up and take over without our permission, and we'll be filled with maybe a sentimentality that isn't really supported by authentic emotion, but it's just a compensation for not wanting to feel the other side of that. And so Hilltending brings us back down to earth, as it were. It allows us to have our feet on the earth and our head in the clouds, or in the universe even.
That is a very good illustration of the beginning points of both of those subjects. And I think people, if they're wondering what these two things are, if you just go on the internet and go to a chat forum such as Reddit, you will see people basically hysterically upset and angry at the current state of the world, and how that, as one friend who writes about these things told me, my personal recycling isn't going to do anything because the 200 largest corporations are the largest polluters of, and what they're doing is outpacing any positive thing I'm doing, and I felt very depressed about that. You can see people ranting about that, and at the same time, you can also witness, if you go on social media, there's people that have sort of devoted their lives to sort of getting away from it all and sort of just staying in nature all the time. And I'm not saying I'm not trying to judge either of these things, but you see them kind of just always talking about nature and the awe of it, but never really addressing the destruction, or addressing any issues or the fact that their ATV riding may be doing something, or some of their habits, or just, whatever they're up to. So you can see sort of these responses to what's going on as the Earth is constantly changing, and with our influence and other influences. And I think in my work I kind of relate that to traumatic. What do humans do in the face of trauma? And if you're on a planet and you don't have control of the fact that it's being rapidly changed to the point where, in some depictions in the next 50 years, coastal cities could be underwater, islands could be underwater. That's not something we want to hear about. And it makes us feel completely out of control, helpless, listless, almost nihilistic in some ways, but also terrified. And I think the Terracentric approach of grief, shame, and anger and fear about the destruction of the habitat, but also the geo-cosmological approaches are both, in my mind, sort of a traumatic response, or a response to trauma of the human who doesn't want to participate in destruction, wants to participate in being part of the Earth family, but feels disempowered.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There, Joanna Macy and Glendenning I believe it was in the late 60s, started a series of workshops with some other facilitators where people were encouraged to share their true and authentic feelings about the state of the world, and not only the state of the Earth, but also the threat of nuclear war and other issues that were going on at the time. And what they found was that the confession of what Pierre Janet called the pathogenic secret was already therapeutic. Just going and saying, yeah, I feel horrible about climate change, or about the pollution, or about the policymakers in Washington or other capitals of the world that are making these policy decisions that are not helping things, that are maybe even making things worse. I'm angry. And there were small group workshops that were repeated successfully time and again around the world, that once that pathogenic secret was confessed in a group and witnessed by other people, there was already a healing effect, because we don't want to feel them, and we sure don't want to talk about them. And we're taught we need to be self-sufficient, we need to be self-independent and able to determine, be the creators of our own destiny, and to go and say, what, I'm helpless about this. Right? I remember one time there was a crow in the road sitting by the body of a dead crow that had got hit by a car, and it was just sitting there. And it might have been a bit of projection or a bit of anthropomorphizing, but to me it looked like that crow was mourning. Right? And it hurt me. I felt really bad because I was witnessing another living creature in the process of grieving the loss of a partner. I couldn't tell anybody about that at the time. Who does that? Who feels bad for a crow? Well, I do. right? And just being able to talk about it freely is already therapeutic. And so in the Hilltending sessions, Hilltending wants to create a safe space where we can engage our authentic relationship to the earth and not feel obligated to participate in the relationship that's been given to us by society or by family or by peers, right? I want to experience my relationship. And when I experience my relationship, I begin to understand I'm not suffering from terminal uniqueness. Everybody feels these things. And so it at the same time, I get closer to myself, but at the same time, it depersonalizes it and it moves it onto the collective level, and I can understand what's going on a little bit better. Moving to the farm last year allows me to understand industrial agriculture better. Doesn't mean I like it, doesn't mean I agree with it, doesn't mean I'm not aware of the damage that it's doing, but at least I understand the motivation for the mechanization of our farms and the industrialized nature of our farms. I mean, I have a small farm, it's only 5.5 acres, but getting work done at this place is made so much easier by having a tractor. I mean, it's night and day. I go about it intelligently. I don't just go to cruise from one side of the farm to the other on the tractor. There has to be something that needs to be done that I can't do otherwise. And so a lot of it's not about moving out to the wilderness and escaping it all. It's about becoming more aware. And once I'm more aware, I can make better decisions. And when I understand why our society has developed, or at least a little bit of why and how our society has developed into this juggernaut of ecological destruction, I can have a different conversation with that part of our culture. Right? We don't need to be separated into the corporate industrial camp and the so-called tree hugger green camp, right? We need to have a conversation. And so becoming more aware of our relationship will empower us to approach that conversation from a completely different basis. And hopefully with better results.
Yes, I think that is a very eloquent way of putting these possibly opposite concepts together. And so we're talking all about ecopsychology and the hilltending that you, as you call it, for your approach to ecotherapy. And last time we talked a lot about how ecotherapy could benefit people that are looking for just to go deeper in themselves and get connected more to themselves, and of course with their with nature, which of course are in your mind is indistinguishable. We talked about people that wanted an alternative to counseling because they didn't really feel like they wanted to just focus on problems. They wanted to empower themselves. We talked about how ecotherapy could be beneficial in addition to people who are already in traditional counseling or psychotherapy to go a little bit deeper in their work. And I do think that ecotherapy is for people that are looking for more depth, and thus, of course, being associated yourself with the Jungian psychology camp and depth psychology work, I do believe this fits in quite well. And so with that being said, what are some things that you think could help people? I know we talked about people feeling more whole when they work on their relationship of the self to their ecological self. It brings a sense of eco-psychological wholeness. Could you touch on that?
So the self, the archetype of self from a Jungian perspective, without the ecological part first, the self is the image of wholeness, right? Jung said it's not God, but it's the image that we have of God. So it's wholeness. It's where all things meet. It's perfection. It's where opposites are integrated. So two of the main archetypes in Jungian psychology are the anima and the animus, the feminine and the masculine, respectively. And in the self, though, they are integrated, right? And so moving towards an ecological self means integrating the terracentric and the geocosmological into something new. It means becoming able to integrate the conversation between industry and ecologically minded people, and to empower a different kind of conversation, because it's the ecological self is where all things meet, right? It's where my resistance to using fossil fuels to work my farm and the recognition of the power of that and why, it's where those meet there in the ecological self as well. So it's the process of ecopsychological development is what I call ecological individuation, kind of building off of Jung's term of individuation. And it's a process getting there. And we'll probably never become fully conscious of the ecological self, because as you kind of alluded to, we perceive, whether there is a separation between us and nature or not, we perceive there to be. And that's how we gain our sense of identity, right? As we grow and develop as humans, we separate from the mother, we separate from different peer groups, et cetera, et cetera. And this is how we gain our sense of identity. And so I shared last time a story about the deer watching the dogs and I move the sheep. So there was a moment of recognition, but there was not a moment where I could see through the deer's eyes, right? So there is a separation there, right? Without that, I would just, dissolve into the void. When I say that there's no separation between humans and nature, what I really mean is that humans are a member of the Earth community, right? Where we are a part of the Earth. We're not apart from. As, autonomous individuals, yes, we have to experience a sense of separation between us and others. So the ecological self, though, is where those things can meet and be experienced as one, right? I can close my eyes. I don't even need to close my eyes, but I can imagine into being a part of a larger whole. And so, again, Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis, right? That the Earth, he said that the Earth is like a living organism. It's self-organizing and different attributes of what life has. And that's how Earth behaves. Later, theorists went on to say it's not like a living organism. It is a living organism. Whether it's like or is, I'm a part of that. You're a part of that. Humans are a part of that. And so becoming more aware of that already eases the discomfort of alienation that we have developed over eons, right, of development. So the ecological self, basically, it's where everything meets and becomes whole. And it's a process of becoming aware and more conscious of our relationship to the Earth that allows us to approach that state. The ecological self is both a process and a state. So the process of individuation is also part of the self. So it's the self is really difficult to talk about, right? It's I don't want to say the holy grail in quotation, air quotes, but it kind of is, because that's where everything meets, right? I was watching a documentary about the Hopi and their origin story, and they were sent basically, or they went on a pilgrimage to find the center place to where they would make their home. And it's that center place it's archetypal, right? You have the stone circles in Europe. You have, circle archaeoastronomy all over the world. And there's always in the center, there's always something, a focal point. And so what the ecological self is, that center point. It's the center place of our relationship to the Earth. But it's also the circumference at the same time. So it's really hard to talk about, to describe, but we can experience it. We can experience moments of unity. We can experience the phenomenology, the events and things that happen in the world as being expressions of that ecological self just as much as I am or as you are. So it's a vague concept, like all archetypes are. So the way we experience the ecological self is through images, right? Like in dream images, that dream that I mentioned earlier about all the spherical objects, those were representations of the self, or they can be engaged as symbolic representations of the self, of wholeness.
Yes, and I do think, if people want to learn more about the self, there's so many podcasts and books from the Jung and the Jungian people that have kind of followed Jung. He doesn't have any podcasts out, but he's quoted in these podcasts to learn more about that.
He does have some interviews on YouTube that are well worth watching, and there's a film, I believe, on Amazon where he's not in the film, but Von Franz is in there, I believe, and other early Jungian analysts.
Yes. Okay, yeah, and and I've even heard there's even more films coming out from other analysts they've interviewed that were working with Jung. So there's a lot there, but I want to make sure we kind of come back to the full concept here, which is that you're offering services and that are more or less kind of like consulting or mentoring or coming alongside people that are wanting to strengthen their relationship to themselves, to work through their feelings and their emotions and their experiences with the natural world. And in your ecotherapy, it's called Hilltending, and I know right now you're working on some group experiences that should be coming up, but right now you're also offering in-person and remote individual meetings. Can you talk a little bit about that before we close?
Right. So I can meet with people and work on what we've talked about today, and any number of other topics that come up. What's important is that there will be meetings outside, right? Initially, we'll probably meet inside for various reasons, but it will move outside. And we can meet in different natural areas around Michigan, in Grand Rapids, Lansing, Battle Creek, Kalamazoo, a lot of different places. Or remotely, we can just do the talking part online on Zoom or Skype or just on the phone or whatever. And then I will help you into certain kinds of exercises to do on your own outside. Or conversely, bringing nature inside. There's a lot of different things that we can do.
And I think the important part for listeners to understand is that this is experiential.
It is.
This is
Absolutely.
experiential. This is not just talking over problems. This is not psychotherapy. It's ecotherapy, which is different. We talked about that in the first podcast.
And it comes back to the idea that the actual ecotherapist is nature. Right? From that perspective, I'm a facilitator or a mentor, a witness. But the actual therapist will be nature and the ecological self that is always present, whether or not we are conscious of it.
And I think for those listeners who are interested, this is an experience. This is not an intellectual exercise. So I would strongly recommend people finding out about your written materials and also contacting you directly. So what's the best way for people to get a hold of you right now?
Well, right now, you can contact me at my website. That will be in the show notes, I guess. Okay, and or by contact any contact form in those and the links provided in those notes.
Yes, and Health for Life Counseling here in Grand Rapids are partnering with Dr. James Leiter to promote ecotherapy and ecopsychology practices, and so he also has a section on our website, so you can also find him that way as well. And I really encourage you to do so. Thanks, James, for coming on the show again.
Thank you for having me again.
Feather, feather, can you tell me
there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician Podcast. If you are a therapist and are looking to become EMDR trained, I would recommend EMDR Training Solutions. They are an amazing group of people that provide trainings online and eventually in person to help you become EMDR trained and eventually EMDRIA certified. You can use the code INTENTIONAL, that's the word intentional, to get $100 off if you purchase a training, especially if it's your first training. A little bit about what I've been up to. I am almost a full EMDRIA consultant, and I can provide consultation hours and have a group going every Wednesday. So let me know if you would like to be a part of that consultation group. Also, I have a course online called What Do We Do Now for the parents of young adults, which you can find on Udemy. There will be a link in the show notes. If you are in need of counseling, do not hesitate to make an appointment with a local counselor in your area. You can also make an appointment with the excellent clinicians in the Grand Rapids area at Health for Life Counseling Grand Rapids and the Trauma Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids by visiting www.healthforlifegr.com. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss and his guests, and while these are based upon literature they have read, their experience in their respective fields, and personal experiences, these viewpoints should not be viewed as the definitive opinion on any subject. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you are in crisis, please dial 911 or the National Suicide Prevention Line at 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-8255. Are you a young person of color, feeling down, stressed out, or overwhelmed? Text Steve, that's STEVE, to 741-741, and a live, trained crisis counselor will respond. Did you know you could support your local bookstore by shopping at bookshop.org? You can order online from the comfort of your own home while supporting a local bookstore near you that is brick and mortar. If you are not a member of a mental health Counselors Association, I highly recommend that you join, such as the Michigan Mental Health Counselors Association, which you can find on the internet, or any other state which you live in. There are a lot of things that go into keeping counseling available to the public. So I really encourage you to get involved in your local organization. Until next time, I'm wishing everyone a safe and peaceful week.
I live by the river where the old gods still dream of inner communion with the open sea. Through the eye of a hunter in search of a prey, neither beast nor human in my philosophy. If you don't recognize me, well, it's simply because I've outgrown these old clothes. Time to move on, for you and I will outlive the masks life gave us when the shadow play comes.